Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. Around the world, autocracy is rearing its head in a new, diverse forms. Authoritarian governments, disinformation campaigns, and human rights abuses are all joining forces to weaken democratic norms and squash human and civil rights globally. China and Russia have been two main spreaders of authoritarianism over the past decade. Through domestic human rights abuses and empowering dictators abroad, the regimes in Beijing and Moscow have worked to sow the seeds for its own rise and democracy's demise globally. Today, we're lucky to be joined by Garry Kasparov, founder of the Renew Democracy Initiative, and Uriel Epshtein, executive director for the Renew Democracy Initiative, to discuss these disturbing trends around the world and what democratic governments can do to prevent the erosion of democratic values. As many of you know, Garry has been a long advocate for human rights and democratic freedoms around the world. He has a long track of record for advocating liberal democracy, democratic values, and standing up to forces of authoritarianism. The youngest world chess champion in history, Garry began his advocacy by supporting Boris Yeltsin's push for capitalism and democracy in the former USSR. In 2005, Garry, in his 20th year as the world's top-rated player, retired from professional chess to join the vanguard of the Russian pro-democracy movement. In 2012, Garry was named chairman of the New York-based Human Rights Foundation, succeeding Václav Havel. Facing imminent arrest during Putin's crackdown, Garry moved from Moscow to New York City in 2013. Since founding RDI in 2017, Garry has been dedicating himself to promoting the principles of free world. RDI brings together prominent figures across the political spectrum and has launched programs to support civics education, integrity in public offices, and vital importance of engaged citizenry. Uriel is a tireless advocate for democratic freedoms around the world. Before joining RDI in 2018, he worked as a consultant at the Boston Consulting Group, then in strategy at startups in the mobile space, including DoorDash and Uber. As a student at Yale University, Uriel founded and continues to chair the Peace and Dialogue Leadership Initiative, and an organization dedicated to bridging the civil-military divide and creating a space on campuses for nuanced discussion of the US role in the Middle East. Garry and Uriel, thank you so much for joining us today. If I could start with you, Garry, what led you to found the Renew Democracy Initiative, and what is RDI's mission and how it's different?
You mentioned that RDI was founded in 2017, nearly 5 years ago. And one can guess it was a response to growing political divide in the United States that led Donald Trump to victory. And elections in 2016 sent a very worrying message to people who, like me, could see the seeds of further discord and conflict. The idea of RDI was to tell Americans about the dangers coming from the rise of radicalism on both sides. The danger of two-party politics being shifted into tribalism, where the center is being decimated because the fringes took too much power, and the voices that typically being discarded as too radical, all of a sudden become the loudspeakers for the respective political parties. And I saw personally, again, being born and raised in the Soviet Union and spending most of my life fighting authoritarian regimes, first Soviet communist dictatorship, followed by Putin's KGB dictatorship. So I saw how the dictators from around the world, and of course Putin was first in my mind because of his KGB background, would use this growing divide to their advantage, to discredit American democracy and democracy as a concept. And from history books that I read, and I read quite a few of them, I knew that democracy never died being attacked from one side, but it always, collapsed when it was besieged by two radical groups. I always remind people that in 1932, Adolf Hitler didn't win elections in Germany. He got something like 37.2%, but the Communist Party made nearly 16. That meant that more than half of German voters rejected democracy. And that probably was a verdict for very feeble democratic institutions of Weimar Republic. What I saw here in America is that we already had in 2017 the mounting attack from Trump's side, from the right, to American traditions and democratic institutions, and total disrespect for certain rules and customs of American political life that, in my view, could lead to even deeper crisis. On the left, I already saw the rise of radicalism of a different side, different type, by trying to undermine American history and denigrate American democracy by looking at the certain ills of the past and trying to portray America as the irredeemable, oppressive country. And I thought it would be very important for Americans to actually understand that unless they recover the strengths of the center of the mainstream politics, the American democracy could be in grave danger. That was the idea behind RDI. And I worked since that moment, I worked tirelessly bringing together people from both sides to trying to create a critical mass of those who might, donate their voice and reputation for this fight.
Thank you. Uriel, if I could get a few comments from you on the issue of how did RDI come up with the idea of front lines of freedom? And I wonder what you hope to accomplish through this project.
So thank you, Nury, for having us on. So Frontlines of Freedom was actually something that Gary and I discussed nearly a year ago. And one of the ways that it began was actually that we noticed that so many of the people involved with our DI, so people on our board, members, people who are interested in coming to work for us, were all either immigrants or children of immigrants. They were people who were essentially what folks call Americans by choice, or their families were in any case. And these are the people who kind of most recognize the excitement and the importance and fragility of American democracy. And so, after a year, 2 years initially of bringing somebody, some of these folks both on board with, on RDI's payroll or the board of directors or others, or other places rather, we figured that it would actually make a lot of sense to try to unite these disparate points of view from all over the world, but which all agree on one thing, which is that American democracy is one of the single most potent forces for freedom in the world, period. And that if American democracy were to fall, or if American democracy were to falter, then a lot of these countries around the world, both democratic and authoritarian, they would see their own democracies start to falter. They would see their own democracies start to fail. And dictators, of course, the world over would point to American democracy and say, oh, is that what you want? You want that for us? And it would just increase their power tenfold. And so that's what launched Frontlines of Freedom. We decided to bring together, I think we have 52 dissidents from 28 oppressive countries in order to essentially communicate that message to Americans of all political stripes. I mean, our goal here is really to break through the partisan divide. It's impossible to say that our dissidents are in some way shilling for the left or for the right. I mean, these are people whose politics are impossible to map onto the American political spectrum. The only thing that they are really prioritizing is American democracy, American freedom. And so I think that's a message that will resonate, especially not just because of what the message is, but because of who's conveying it.
Thank you. I am one of those Americans by choice. Yeah, I heard this expression quite often by late Congressman Tom Lantos, who was a champion of human rights and democracy, as you may know. Gary, if I could go back to you, you frequently said that dictators are great at tactics, but bad at strategy. Can you expand upon this, and how can democratic nations compete with authoritarian ones on a tactical level?
Nury, thank you very much for mentioning Tom Lantos. That's one of the really big heroes, the lions who fought fiercely for democracy worldwide. And it's very unfortunate that U.S. Congress, U.S. political elite is missing people like him or John McCain, those who knew that American leadership was instrumental, not only to help others around the world, but also to keep the very much the spirit of idea alive. It's in the globalized world, you can't ignore human rights violations and abuses elsewhere and not eventually being without endangering your own freedom. So we can only hope for new generation of leaders to emerge, but naturally, though names like Tom Lantos, there will be like North Stars of human rights, global human rights fights. Now, you asked about dictatorships and democracies, the way they operate strategically and tactically, and that's the language that I understand, since it's related to the game of chess. And I always pointed out that the strength of the free world was always strategy, long-term planning, for a simple reason. Democracies have a luxury of continuity. The policy designed by one administration, one government, will not be abandoned. It might be, but that it doesn't happen automatically. So there's a continuity, and if it's a real strategy that has been agreed upon by major political groups, it stays. So we can go back to mid-40s when Harry Truman administration had to face the threat from Soviet communism. And let's not forget that the Soviet Union was led by Joseph Stalin, not by Putin, but Joseph Stalin. And that was a very formidable enemy who didn't hide his intentions to spread communism to the most remote parts of the globe. And Truman's administration worked out a strategic plan to contain communism. And the policy of containment became a cornerstone of American strategy for the next 4 decades. So they built institutions to support it. In America, it was National Security Council, CIA, the shifts of Voice of America to become a strong voice for freedom, which led eventually to create Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. And of course, NATO, the Marshall Plan, supporting Europe. And presidents who followed Harry Truman, Republicans and Democrats alike, they always, they could have some differences, but the strategy was there. And it's not surprising that the policies conceived and built by a Democratic president eventually succeeded with the Republican presidents, Ronald Reagan and Bush 41. Today, alas, we see that it's no longer the case. It's all, like a pendulum. You have one administration does one thing, like Obama, and then there's Trump, and then Biden, and it gives huge advantage to dictatorial regimes because they're not struggling or they're not fighting against well thought long-term strategy. And if you're talking about tactical responses, unfortunately here, it's virtually impossible for democracies to compete because every big decision made in America or in Europe, it's a complicated process of negotiations, searching for consensus, understanding how the public will respond, while dictator doesn't care. He can move on making big decisions. He doesn't care about the public opinion, about the press criticism, about parliament. It's all, it's all in his hands. And unless the free world comes up with a plan. So not to think about the tomorrow or day after tomorrow, but have 5-10 years plan, and the core element of this plan will be the well-being of democracy worldwide. Nothing is going to change, and the latest debacles of American administration, like one is tragic, one is in Afghanistan. They just send a clear message to both to American foes and friends alike, that America is no longer the same factor as it used to be.
Hey, Gary, if I can follow up on that important issue, you mentioned the lack of leadership, lack of recognition in the Western democracies about the rise of authoritarianism, which is posing threat to democratic freedoms around the world. Without acknowledging, recognizing the issues, we will not be able to come up with a strategic approach or pushback. So how seriously should the democracies be worried about the trend, the rise of authoritarianism around the world, quietly, subtly, strategically pushed, promoted, and exported by Russia and China?
Look, if we go back to 1991, the moment of the big triumph for liberal democracy, the Soviet Union collapsed, the Eastern Europe was free, and democracy was the only game in town. And the best-selling book of 1992, Francis Fukuyama, The End of History, reflected this joyful mood. So we all expected the future to be bright. There will be some problems, but nothing as big, as dangerous as during the Cold War. We were wrong because we ignored the simple fact that the evil doesn't die. Right. It can be buried for a while under the rubbles of Berlin Wall. But the moment we lose our vigilance, the moment we become complacent, it sprouts out. And we had great expectations back then in the Soviet Union. It's actually in Russia, so after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I don't think anybody could think of KGB lieutenant colonel taking over in 9 years in 2000 and rebuilding, actually making even just the worst kind of dictatorship that included all the ills of authoritarianism, from corruption to terror. While I don't want to push the blame to the free world, because again, at the end, it was our country, and we have to bear most of the responsibility. But I think the free world lost also the sense of danger, and it was not recognized that the collapse of democracy elsewhere could actually threaten democracy in the free world. Because democracy was looked like one-way street. Oh, it all goes in one direction. The end of history. So there's no way back, no reverse, no backpedaling. No, actually not. So the Putin's success story, and I don't want whether we should put success in inverted commas, but it was a successful dictatorship. So he is in power for more than 20 years. The rise of Chinese new Chinese dictator. China was always dictatorship, but now we have not Communist Party dictatorship only, but one-man dictatorship, which makes it even more dangerous, because one-man dictatorship is less concerned about any loss of geopolitical prestige. It's more about the one-man show. So it's if he decides to push, the whole machine, just goes in this direction. No checks and balances of the Politburo deliberation. And if you look at the world map now, so 15 straight years, we see the decline of democracy. And it's not that new countries, the countries that joined the club of democratic nations, they are losing the ground. Now we'll see the countries that we thought solidly in the column of democracy, the members of European Union. Now they also see that some of the democratic rules can be banned, not abolished, but banned. Hungary is a classical example. So I wouldn't, of course, compare Hungary to Turkey, but still, Hungary is a big question mark. So it's,
Right.
but when you look at Turkey, you just understand that the country that hopefully was on the way to European Union 20 years ago,
Right.
now it just, it became another stronghold of authoritarianism, aggression, imperialist policies, and obviously, total lack of respect for any human rights. One of the reasons, Erdogan looked at Putin. So why not? So it did work. But moreover, we could see the rise of illiberal tendencies in the West, in the traditional West. When I say West, it's Western Europe and the United States. The rise of Donald Trump and the rise of liberalism in America, and the rise of the very antagonists on the far right and far left in most of the European countries. You look at every European country, you'll find one far left party and one far right party, and both are doing fine in the elections. They're not, they're no longer pariahs. That's a result of this ongoing campaign funded and organized by dictators, by Putin and Xi Jinping. So, as you said, export. So, what we found out, now we learned, and hopefully, we will learn something useful out of this lesson, that trying to have this, the exchange and opening up and reaching out, apologizing as Obama did, and so bringing goodies to dictators, hoping that the exchange of goods, the free trade, and cultural connections, so will soften the regimes and will liberalize every regime. It didn't work. It was the most spectacular failure. No matter whether you're talking about Russia, China, Cuba, you name it, Nicaragua, Venezuela, it's all the same. But to add insult to injury, it's not just these countries are not changing. Instead of us exporting democracy from the free world into unfree world, we see the reverse now traffic, right. The corruption and intolerance and right. all the ills of undemocratic world are being transferred, transmitted like a virus right. that right. attacks our immune system. And unfortunately, the immune system in America or Western Europe is not ready to deal with these viruses, because again, genetic memory doesn't contain the very important antibodies to actually right. to confront it. And that's what we're trying to do now, just basically to wake up this genetic memory, warning people in America and Europe, mostly in America, that unless they recognize that the freedom cannot be separated, and loss, freedom in Afghanistan hurts American, loss of freedom in Russia or in China hurts American, because dictators, they're no longer contained by their borders. Thanks to technology that have been invented and designed in the free world, thanks to social media, they can reach out. Right. And of course, we know that fake news and troll factories prove to be a very effective ideological weapon against divided free world.
And just to really quickly add to that tour de force, I think global view, Gary used the metaphor of us not having the antibodies in free societies against this. And, who has better antibodies than folks like you, Nury, and you, Gary, people who have actually lived under these regimes, who have lived under oppression, who have fought against it, who have risked their lives fighting against that oppression. And it's really those views and those antibodies that we want to bring to the US. I mean, if I could change up the metaphor a little bit, democracies in a lot of ways are like college kids. Right. And when you're in college, you're not going to do an assignment until there's a deadline, until it's due the next day, unless you're really that exceptional student who is right. so studious and well organized that they're willing to do it weeks in advance. I think the vast majority of us were, staying up late the night before when we're like, oh my God, I have to do this by tomorrow. And unfortunately, that's human nature. I think democracies around the world were the same way. When the Soviet Union fell, the biggest threat was gone. And so we're like, all right, we've done what we need to do. Now we can focus inward and we can grow out our societies. We can grow out our open economies and assume that we will ultimately export democracy. Of course, as Gary pointed out, the exact opposite thing happened, and we ended up importing authoritarianism. And so now that we have authoritarianism in our borders, it's really dissidents, people who have fought those battles, who can offer, I think, the greatest possible perspective on how to combat it, the greatest possible perspective on how this is a horrific threat. And so that's really what we're trying to do with Voices of Freedom, is we're trying to offer these antibodies, we're trying to offer these points of view to Americans in a way that will hopefully have, really try to avoid the partisan battles of today, because this isn't it shouldn't be a partisan question, although obviously, these types of things inevitably become polarized and they become partisan. Ultimately, the question of whether or not our freedoms survive has nothing to do with whether you are on the left or the right.
Right. Very insightful. It reminded me something that I wanted to. They mentioned that the Chinese and Russian exportation of authoritarianism also involves technology. We've been reading and hearing this new term, digital authoritarianism, quite often. In the Chinese case, they have not only developed and tested the surveillance technologies, techniques, now exported over 80 countries. So, and our own big tech giants are not being helpful either. Uriel, if you could comment on this question. As you know, the Apple, YouTube, Facebook, all trying to get access for years in China, Russian markets. And I wanted to hear what we can do to prevent the erosion of democratic values as these corporate giants, American businesses, continue to bow to foreign pressure instead of changing themselves.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you've really put really pointed out I think the key element of the problem. And Nury, we were talking about this, I think, right before this. But the first thing is that it's hard for us to expect of these companies what we don't expect from our own governments, right? I mean, if the American government, if Western free nations, and not just Western, but if free nations around the world don't stand up to authoritarian regimes, and these free nations incidentally have armies, they have intelligence agencies, they have sort of, by definition, a monopoly on the legitimate uses of violence. How can we expect private companies which don't have those armies, which don't have those intelligence agencies, at least not in the same sense that an actual state would, how can we expect them to do a better job of standing up against authoritarian regimes than our own governments do? So I think that's the first thing that we need to recognize, is that we need to put pressure on our governments to support our private companies to actually be able to oppose the type of pressure that China and Russia bring to bear. That's number one. Number two, though, I think certainly we can and should bring pressure onto those companies directly as well. I mean, ultimately, when the NBA puts profits above people and actually prevents one of its own general managers from speaking out in defense of Hong Kong, and then meanwhile, one of their greatest stars, LeBron James, goes on an unbelievably shameful apology tour, saying how great China is and how this general manager misunderstood the situation on Hong Kong. I mean, that's unconscionable. And it speaks to the fact that they're really putting profit over everything else, putting profit over lives, while at the same time speaking out in support of any number of social justice causes in the US, which of course are not risky for them to do. And, they could be very good causes and very worthwhile causes, but let's not pretend that LeBron James speaking out in support of social justice causes risks a single dollar that he would have otherwise earned. Meanwhile, the only thing that might have actually been a risk for him, speaking out against China, he doesn't appear willing to do. So I think it really needs to be that two-pronged approach of, one, putting pressure on our governments to actually support companies and empower them to oppose authoritarian regimes. And two, we need to, in some way, put pressure on these companies in the same way as I think many activists have very successfully done on any number of issues, to say, listen, if you're going to prioritize, tens of millions of dollars from China, and in so doing, sacrifice the Uyghurs or the Hong Kong democracy activists, well, then you're going to lose tens of millions of dollars in the US.
Thank you.
I have to add, you mentioned two-pronged approach. I would add the third one. It's public. Let's not forget, there's always a triangle: government, corporations, and public. And public can have a massive impact, both on government, but also on corporations. I mean, look, that's how quickly all these companies, accepted, the language of social justice because it became popular, and they knew that the customers are very sensitive to that. Now, the problem is that LeBron James and others, and I don't want to curse because just, that the moment I'm getting really, angry and my blood is boiling when I hear these multimillionaires who are so, aggressive in advocating for social and racial justice in America. They become, the advocates of the genocide.
Yeah.
It's in America they fight against police brutality, which is a problem. But we come from the countries where police brutality is a system. And again, as Europe pointed out, LeBron James is not taking any risk. The moment American public believes, the moment the majority or a great chunk of people here believe that the freedom elsewhere is important. The genocide of Uyghurs is a crime against humanity. The Chinese Communist Party is a criminal organization. Putin's aggression against Ukraine and his carpet bombing in Syria, that's also crimes against humanity. Assad is a butcher. And the moment they understand that we live in a world that is interdependent, they can easily punish LeBron James by simply just switching off, even for one game, their TVs. And that's it. The moment the American public sends a message to LeBron James, all these NBAs, that's it. Because American market is much bigger than Chinese market. But so far, they don't have to make choices. Right. Why not to keep Chinese market? It's 15% of the money that comes into NBA.
Yeah.
Right. So that's one of the things we should do by pushing projects like Front Lines of Freedom, by telling American public, that they have also responsibility. And if they do nothing about freedom in China or in Russia or Iran, they will pay the price. Because in an interconnected world, would-be dictators in America or in other free world countries, they will learn and they will be encouraged, emboldened by the actions of Xi Jinping and Putin. So the fact is that China now is in the position to dictate the terms of freedom of speech on certain issues in America. Inconceivable. Absolutely inconceivable. So the First Amendment in the United States was protected by Constitution. Is no longer guarantees you safety, because the communist dictatorship now holds American businesses a ransom for a simple reason. That's that American public is not ready to send an unequivocal message to these corporations that they will have, if China continues doing this, they will have to choose between Chinese market and the American market. And that will send a message back to China. And I bet you they will change their behavior.
And you're absolutely right. It's just not mind-boggling, but it's deeply disturbing that those vocal voices in the United States when it comes to social justice issues and other issues, racial issues, just dead quiet. And I can't imagine any country locks up its 1 million or plus members of a religious minority group. I can't imagine that the world will be staying this quiet. And to this day, there's no former or current heads of state except for Joe Biden. Joe Biden called it genocide when he was running for president. Even publicly made a statement, particularly the one in Europe. So on that point, Gary, if I may come back to you, in recent COP26 summit, China and Russia, Xi Jinping and Putin didn't show up, knowing that China is the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases. And when we know that China and Russia are developing closer ties against the West, liberal democracies. And the two countries have protected each other at the UN, have formed the United Front against the United States, and been conducting series of joint military exercises. And how ideological is the threat that these countries pose to us in the Western liberal democracies? And how should the United States and its allies respond to these aggressions coming from Beijing and Moscow?
Yeah, you pointed out that there's a growing cooperation between Russia and China, though I think it's not a cooperation on equal footing, because China is bigger, more powerful, and I think that's from the Chinese perspective, Russia is a junior partner. It's definitely, historically junior partner, and Chinese government believes that that Putin is playing a pivotal role for them by aggressively pushing his agenda and weakening the Western alliances. So I would separate the threats from China and Russia, following what we discussed 20 minutes ago on strategy and tactics. Chinese threat is strategic. China has resources, population, also determination to have this long-term challenge. Russia is a tactical threat. Putin doesn't care about long-term future. Putin doesn't think about centuries. He doesn't have this Chinese tradition that could give his regime, some sort of historical importance. So he makes some references to Russian history, but it's more about finding rulers like Ivan the Terrible or Joseph Stalin, those who put themselves above the law. That's all he wants to find out from Russian history. In China, it's far more complicated, and again, China has resources and clearly has a view of imperial view, viewing probably half of Russian territory as a future realm of new Chinese empire. So that tells me that the best way to deal with that is to address the threat, which is immediate, and that comes from Putin. Mm-hmm. And also Putin is weaker. So trying to shift from one side to another, we hear now, oh, Russia is too weak, let's concentrate on China. That typically covers if not impotence, their unwillingness to deal with dictators. Also, Putin's aggressive policy is aiming at the very unity of the free world, and he did much better job in buying favors, actually buying politicians and business people in Europe, less in the United States. So again, it's more visible. I'm sure China is also pretty active, but we could see so many pro-Putin politicians. It's also inconceivable to imagine that so many top-tier politicians in Europe now either working directly for Putin or indirectly, cooperating with his oligarchs. And I think that is, again, without recognizing why it's important. So why it's vital for the interest of the free world to confront these policies of Russia and China, both tactically and strategically. It's not going to work, because we see Putin's bold moves and him testing the West everywhere from Ukraine and Moldova to Syria and to Africa, and China looking at Putin, looking at other failures of American foreign policy, and steadily building its military capability to move against Taiwan, and also to spread its global influence using economic and, as you pointed out, technological advances. So again, China pretends it could be an example of the future world. And to those who are agreeable to this point of view, my response is very simple. No, never forget, China gave us virus. America has created an antidote.
Thank you. Certain policy circles, especially now, I do not believe that we have a clear, coherent policy with respect to Russia and China. And there's some people, policy experts in various circles, and especially in think tanks, calling for easing tensions with Russia and China. And I'm curious if that's the right approach, and how should the United States approach these two countries in particular, Russia and China, in the future foreign relations or U.S. global relationships?
So what I'll say here, But I actually think one of the things that I think we're seeing, and Gary sort of touched upon this a little bit in his conversation of tactics versus strategy, is actually a coordination problem. Gary highlighted right now, Putin has a host of European leaders in his pocket, which is incredible. I mean, right, you're talking about the former German chancellor is literally wholly and completely on Putin's payroll, unabashedly. I mean, it's open for everybody knows Schroeder works for Putin. It's common knowledge. And the reason, of course, for that is that Putin as an individual controls more money than any human being on the planet by probably orders of magnitude, right? I mean, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk have nothing on Putin. And that means that Putin by himself, there is no coordination problem for him. He by himself can decide whatever he wants to do, and he can put billions of dollars into people's pockets in order to corrupt them. Now, on the Democratic side, there is no single person who can wield that much power, whether financially or politically. Instead, we have a diverse array of stakeholders, both internally within a democracy like the US and amongst democracies around the world. But if we were to actually create some sort of supranational organization, I mean, it doesn't even have to be an organization, at the very least, a conversation, a platform, something that would allow democracies to collaborate with one another in order to promote democratic aims globally rather than regionally or nationally, that would actually be incredibly powerful. And in order to do that, of course, you would not have to sacrifice any sovereignty. You would not have to sacrifice anything along those lines. All you would have to do is get countries to, be in the proverbial room together. Right now, I'm thinking about it as we're talking. There does not exist a single organization or grouping of countries for democracies. Not even NATO right now, could be described that way given Turkey's participation. And as a result, we don't have that kind of concerted effort in order to combat authoritarianism. So when I think about how do you combat countries like China and Russia, one of the things that I don't think is talked about nearly enough is some form of concerted effort among free nations. And, to Obama's credit to some extent, he tried to do that with China. Through the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, which of course was ultimately torpedoed by his successor, although Hillary actually said she would have taken America out of it as well. But I think it's that kind of effort that we need to do, where we bring these free nations together and we support one another and offer alternatives to authoritarian countries. And then the last thing I'll say is, of course, we need to avoid shooting ourselves in the foot. So Germany getting rid of nuclear power, so then create Nord Stream 2, and essentially just completely rely upon Russia for their energy needs. Essentially what they did was they gave Putin the knife to the European collective energy throat, and then assume that Putin's never actually going to use it. So anyway, obviously we need to avoid those types of self-imposed mistakes or unforced errors. But more importantly, I think it has to do with us actually coming together in order to be able to engage in collective action and impose some measure of cost on these dictatorships.
Thank you. Gary, you mentioned about U.S. leadership earlier. As you know, in the United States, there are a lot of people, in perhaps in growing numbers, call for the U.S. to remove itself from the international stage. You mentioned Afghanistan. What happens if the United States stops engaging with the world? How important is American leadership in helping to reverse the trend of authoritarianism, specifically pushback against, in defense of democracy and pushback against authoritarianism?
We already spoke about the vitality of U.S. leadership for preserving democracy worldwide, and about globalized world that depends, where we all depend on each other, and the loss of freedom elsewhere eventually hurts America and other free countries. But we can look beyond that. You just said, what would happen if America withdrew from everywhere? Yeah. Then America is no longer world leader. And the first question is going to be asked, and China will be definitely asking it, maybe pushing others. Why US dollar is the reserve currency? Mm-hmm. This is something that American far right or far left, they simply don't understand. So America can't afford all these giant social programs because dollar is reserve currency, and U.S. bonds, can be bought, so could be sold and then bought, and that's how you can finance the massive debt that is over 100% of GDP. The moment dollar loses its status, America will be on the verge of bankruptcy. So, and while dollar is reserve currency, because America is still recognized as the global leader. Abandoning global leadership politically and militarily means you'll abandon it financially and economically. Right. So it's a package. You cannot separate it. And it's very unfortunate that you have so many voices here. Most of them are stupid, but some of them I believe, are not stupid at all. Some of them, really want America to suffer. Some of them believe that America's leadership in the world is negative because they believe in something else. Right. They believe in utopian socialist and communist ideas, and they always offer excuses for communist dictators, whether in Cuba, China, Russia, or elsewhere. So it is a problem. But I see no other choice for America to continue its role as a global leader, because weak America, means that the whole world will be less safe. And it's the whole story with the pandemics proved again that America was and still is indispensable to respond to global crisis. It is amazing that those who trashed America and called it, that's the dead end of civilization, and blasted capitalism for all the ills that one can imagine, and praised centralized vaccine, centralized economy. So they are all of a sudden now they want America to save the world by doing more on vaccination. Right. Yeah, personally, I would say that people who were so negative on America and so positive on China, that they would be denied, vaccination by Moderna and Pfizer, and they should be forced to take Sputnik or Sinovac. So again, just pay the price. If you're so happy with the Chinese economy, okay, enjoy the benefits, and there will be more vaccines available for people who are not so negative on America, and they're now desperately awaiting for America to have another $100 million available for people elsewhere.
You and I have the first-hand experience living in those countries. We know exactly how it works. So,
Nury,
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Just to really quickly jump in, that actually brings, Gary, I think Gary implied it. I just want to make it very, very explicit. Those who say that American involvement abroad is in some way altruistic, or is that supporting human rights are in some way altruistic, or that opposing dictators is us taking a hit in order to stand by our ideals, while to some extent true, ultimately these are very selfish acts. These are things that that allow us to defend our own prosperity, defend our own success, and if we eschew them, if we forget about them, we're actually the ones who are going to suffer. And that's one of the key things that I don't really think people talk about enough. I mean, whenever human rights are brought up in conversation, it's always about doing what's right, which is important. And, don't get me wrong, I think morality and ethics are, really should be cornerstones of politics. But ultimately, I mean, it's also about doing what's right for us. And supporting human rights is absolutely the right thing for the US, because it's what will ensure American prosperity over the long term.
Right. On that note, Uriel, if I may ask you about the RDI's work with respect to education. As you know, one crucial aspect of your organization's work is education. And in your opinion, how well aware do you think the American people are about the threat of authoritarianism, and how can we better educate our fellow Americans about this rising threat, and what can dissidents teach Americans about democracy?
Nury, I'm sure the answer won't surprise you, which is to say they're not very well aware at all. I'll never forget. I mean, I was speaking to a friend of mine in this, very well educated. And a couple of times I mentioned this project to him, and I said, hey, listen, we're working with a number of Uyghurs, and a couple of times I used the term Uyghur. And finally, on the third time was when he finally asked, he's like, sorry, you keep using this term. I feel like I thought I was mishearing you. Can you tell me what a Uyghur is? What is this? And this is somebody who's pretty well educated. And again, I think it just goes to show that these are not things that most Americans think about or talk about. And it's something that I think is actually a very serious problem. Because what it does then is, for a lot of these folks, they look at American democracy. And American flaws are self-evident, right? I mean, there's so many problems with American democracy. So many things just don't work or work inefficiently. I mean, as Gary pointed out, dictatorship is an infinitely more tactically efficient system of government. You have one person calling the shots. They can do so quickly and decisively. Meanwhile, when you have a whole host of people who are wanting to negotiate with one another, it's both slow, inefficient, and frequently in the short term, imperfect, right? I mean, how's that old phrase go? A camel is a horse drawn by committee. And so as a result, people look at American democracy, they see all these imperfections, and they say, oh, okay, American democracy is terrible. It's fundamentally flawed. It's ineffective. And you either have people saying, oh, well, we should actually centralize power more and decrease checks and balances.
Yeah, Uriel, but I don't want our listeners actually and viewers to get a wrong idea, so that democracy is not effective. You correctly pointed out that the dictators are tactically more efficient, but unless democracy has a plan, because if democratic government has a strategy, and it's these strategies being respected and continued by one administration after another, that's a different story. I always remind people about the first debates between televised debates between Nixon and Kennedy all the way back in 1960. So when they talked about different approaches, but they never challenged the goals. It's about means, not goals. So right now the problem is that we do not agree on goals. We do not agree what America is and what America will be. Actually, we don't agree what America was. So, and that's that creates total havoc and chaos, both in reality, but also online. And dictators are so good; they're so opportunistic by grab this chance and to spread the divide even further.
And that's exactly what we need to educate people on. I mean, that ultimately, Gary kind of shortened the answer a bit here, which is that's what people don't know. They see the flaws, but they don't see the benefits. And the benefits are there, and they're huge. And that's what RDI is trying to educate the public on. We want to show people, one, what is the alternative, right? So in other words, if you get rid of American democracy, or if you say that we are in some way fundamentally oppressive or something else, well, what does it mean to actually be oppressive? What does it mean? What are the alternatives to American democracy? And that's something that I think dissidents are in a very uniquely strong position to share with the American people. What is the alternative to American democracy? Because it's certainly not the kingdom of heaven, right? I mean, there's no such thing as utopia. And so dissidents are in a unique position to show Americans, listen, if you think your democracy is so horrible or so irredeemable, here's what you could actually look forward to in terms of an alternative. So that's one. Two is, I think people actually need to be educated about what American democracy is, right? That's, I think, one of the things that a lot of people don't understand. 2/3 of Americans cannot name the 3 branches of American government. That's something that I think is really dangerous. And if you can't name the 3 branches, just think about how few people could explain why we have 3 branches, what the importance of that division of power is. And so that's what RDI is looking to do, where on the one hand, we want to offer outsider perspectives on the crises and challenges facing American democracy. And 2, we want to offer incredibly unique, engaging, exciting insights into how American democracy actually functions and can function, if we continue engaging in positive reform. And we actually believe that by taking these 2 elements together, both an education focused on sort of domestic democratic priorities, as well as this outside-in perspective on American democracy, we can give people the tools that they need in order to hold their leaders accountable in the long term.
Thank you. We are reaching to the top of the hour. Before we leave, I'd like to ask both of you if you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share with our audience.
Gary, why don't you go first?
It will be a long list, of course, but I think that's what's important for people in America, in Europe, in the free world, to recognize their responsibility for global democracy, but also for democracy in their countries. They have to understand that democracy is worth fighting for. But as once Ronald Reagan said, democracy is very fragile. It's never more than one generation away from extinction. And now I want them to feel it so that they, unlike their parents or grandparents that never had the same kind of a battle, they are facing a new challenge. And I hope they will be up to this challenge. And I will be more than happy to use our experience, the experience and the manpower of dissidents from all over the world to educate people in the free world, primarily in the United States, and to make sure that we all join forces to fight for democracy, which means fighting for a brighter future for all humanity.
You know, a lot of this conversation reminds me of, you know, one I would say one of the sort of key moments in my own past related to this project happened about 10 years ago. You know, I'd known for many years, even at that point, about the Jewish exodus from the Middle East that happened in the late 1940s, where you had 750,000 Jews get expelled from Middle Eastern countries. But, you know, I always knew that as an academic fact. It was a historical fact. I always felt a certain level of distance from these folks until I read, there was a book that was written by Ari Shavit years ago called My Promised Land, and he dedicates a chapter in his book to talking about some of those Jews who had been exiled from the Middle East, and he offers a few anecdotal stories. And I'd always assumed that these were people who were living on the margins of society, people who were always sort of hanging on by a thread. And of course, what the truth is that it was, you know, it was the exact opposite. I mean, these were many of these families were incredibly wealthy. Many of them were incredibly well connected, living in sort of the major urban centers of their respective countries. And in particular, he follows this one family who went from living in a palace near Baghdad to living in a 100 square foot studio in Haifa. And upon reading that was the first time that I ever felt insecure living as a Jew in America. And it's that insecurity that I want to share with people related to American democracy. I want people to know that no matter our grand democratic history, ultimately this is an experiment. And over the course of human history, authoritarianism is much more common than freedom. And if we don't take effort and take action in order to defend our democracy, then ultimately we may revert to the mean. And that mean, of course, is one in which most of us will not have any freedom, and we will actually be living on the margins of society.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Uriel, for being here to talk about these important issues. I appreciate your time and sharing your wisdom with us. I have a message to our audience. You can visit and learn more about the RDI's work at its website, www.rdi.org. I encourage everyone to visit the website and become involved in any way that you can in defense of democracy. Thank you very much to you all and for your participation. Once again, thank you so much, Gary and Uriel, for taking the time.
Thank you very much for inviting us.